A black single mother boarded a luxury flight holding nothing but a quiet presence in a first-class seat in row 1A. The flight attendant. She didn't ask for her name. She didn't check her ticket. She simply looked at her and decided she didn't belong. But what no one knew was that the woman they tried to remove didn't just own the seat. She owned the entire airline. What started as humiliation would soon become a national reckoning, and the slap meant to silence her. It became the sound that woke the skies. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if stories of justice matter to you, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell because this one will stay with you long after the flight lands. The soft chime of boarding announcements echoed through LAX's private terminal as passengers filed quietly toward Gate 9A. This wasn't the usual chaos of economy-class travel. No rushed check-ins or children clinging to stuffed toys. This was Sky Era Aviation's elite line, a direct, non-stop flight from Los Angeles to New York, with a first-class cabin curated to feel more like a high-rise lounge than an aircraft. Inside the jet, the cabin was a world of curated comfort, cream-colored leather seats arranged in a spacious 1-1 layout, backlit wood-grain panels, a bar stocked with rare Japanese whiskey, and gold-accented window frames that glowed softly under warm cabin lights. The faint scent of bergamot floated through the air. A jazz quartet whispered through the Bose surround system. Every inch of the cabin whispered status. That is until Ava Hartley stepped through the boarding door. She didn't look like the others, at least not to the kind of people who measured worth by watches or handbags. Ava, a 34-year-old black woman, wore no jewelry. Her hair was tied back into a simple low bun. She carried a weathered laptop bag and wore a dark blue linen blazer over a plain ivory blouse. Flat shoes, not heels. No designer logos, no personal assistant trailing behind her. She walked with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't ask for permission. There was no hesitation in her step, only clarity. As she approached the first-class cabin, a few heads subtly turned. A man in a tailored gray suit glanced at her, then returned to his newspaper. An older woman in pearls did a double-take and whispered something to the woman beside her lips, curling upward in speculation. Brenda Fields, the head flight attendant for this route, stood near the entrance to the premium cabin. Her posture was practiced, spine straight, smile strained. The moment Ava reached the threshold, Brenda's smile faltered. "Excuse me," Brenda said, stepping into Ava's path, with the efficiency of someone used to control. "First class begins here. May I help you find your seat?" Ava stopped unfazed. Her eyes, dark and steady, met Brenda's without even a blink. "Yes," she said softly. Brenda's brow furrowed. Her eyes swept from Ava's plain shoes to her natural curls. "Are you sure?" she asked, tilting her head with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This is the Sky Era elite cabin. Sometimes people get confused." Ava didn't flinch. She calmly pulled out her phone and raised the digital boarding pass to eye level. The bright blue code on the screen blinked clearly. Flight SC422, Seat 1A. Brenda didn't even glance at the screen. Her lips pursed. "Huh?" she said under her breath, then louder. "Just a moment. I'll check the manifest." But she didn't move. Passengers nearby stirred. No one spoke up, but a man in 2C lowered his drink and watched with curiosity. Another passenger leaned slightly into the aisle, pretending to adjust a cufflink. Ava stood still, her spine aligned like a dancer's. Her silence wasn't passive, it was deliberate. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't apologize for being in the wrong place because she wasn't. Her entire demeanor said one thing without needing words. "You're about to regret assuming I don't belong here." Brenda finally stepped aside, hesitating a half-second too long. "You may proceed," she said tightly. Ava gave a soft nod and walked past. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The seat was hers. And soon enough they'd realize that everything about this woman, this black single mother in flats and linen, was exactly where it was meant to be. And the flight had only just begun. Brenda Fields was good at her job, at least in the eyes of those who looked like they belonged. Her blazer was always pressed, her tone clipped but courteous, her smile just wide enough to seem warm but never open. She had worked 20 years in luxury aviation and had built a reputation for running a tight ship. But in truth, Brenda didn't serve first class. She guarded it. As Ava Hartley stepped into the plush aisle of the Sky Era elite cabin and gently placed her bag in the overhead bin above 1A, Brenda moved quickly down the aisle, heels clicking in tight rhythm. "Ma'am," Brenda said, her voice a shade louder now, "are you absolutely sure you're in the right section?" Ava turned slowly, her hands resting calmly at her sides. Her tone was still polite but firmer than before. Yes, seat 1A. I showed you my boarding pass. Brenda crossed her arms, the faintest smirk rising at the corner of her mouth. I just want to make sure we've had mix-ups before. She said the last two words like a warning cloaked in civility. This time Ava didn't raise her phone. She didn't need to prove herself again. You didn't look the first time, she said quietly. Brenda blinked. Around them, a few murmurs bubbled beneath the quiet of jazz and clinking glass. Megan Cross. The older woman in pearls leaned toward her seatmate with a knowing look. She probably got a last-minute upgrade, Megan whispered, not even attempting to lower her voice. Must be one of those mileage things, the seatmate replied. Doesn't look like the usual crowd. Daniel Jennings, seated in 1C, lifted his head and glanced briefly over his glasses. His brow furrowed just slightly. He had seen Ava's poise as she boarded, the kind of control that didn't come from privilege, but from pressure. She hadn't looked around. She hadn't fumbled. She had walked in like she knew how the world worked and how often it didn't work in her favor. Ava sat down slowly, adjusting her posture, tucking a loose curl behind her ear. She heard them. She always heard them. The whispers, the side eyes, the assumptions, and with them the memories. The time she had shown up to a hedge fund interview in Chicago and been told, "You must be looking for the receptionist opening." The five-star hotel in Dallas where a concierge had asked her twice if she needed directions to the lobby while she stood at the executive suite check-in counter. The day she took her toddler daughter to a luxury mall and was followed through every store by security. Not angry memories, just familiar ones. Brenda still stood at the end of the row, clipboard in hand, unmoving. Ava looked up again, this time holding the woman's gaze. "Is there a problem, Ms. Fields?" she asked, voice smooth, even. Brenda smiled then, but it wasn't kind. It was the smile of a gatekeeper who'd just realized her key didn't fit the door she was guarding. Still, she tried one last time to assert something, anything. "I just didn't recognize your name. That's all." Ava didn't blink. "You didn't ask." For a beat, neither woman spoke. Then, without another word, Brenda turned on her heel and walked briskly back toward the galley, her posture stiff, her eyes flickering just once to the manifest tucked in her clipboard. The name Ava Hartley was printed clearly bolded and marked priority, internal, in small gold font. She hadn't read it. She hadn't bothered to. And in doing so, she'd just drawn the first line in a story that would unravel faster than she could imagine. And Ava. She folded her hands in her lap and looked forward, eyes calm, back straight. Let them wonder, let them whisper, because they were about to learn, assuming who someone is can be far more dangerous than not knowing at all. The cabin air was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that settles before something shifts. Soft jazz still played and the lights still glowed amber, but beneath the curated luxury, a tension was brewing. Brenda Fields stood just beyond row 1, posture ramrod straight, lips drawn into a tight line. Her fingers gripped her tablet, though she hadn't looked at it once since Ava sat down. Her eyes didn't blink. "She wasn't used to being defied, ma'am," she said again, louder this time. Her smile was gone now. "I'm going to ask you once more. If you don't move to the rear cabin, I'll be forced to call security." Her voice didn't shake, but there was something in her tone, something sharp, almost personal. Ava Hartley didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or shift in her seat. She simply turned toward Brenda, her hands still folded neatly in her lap. "I'm not moving," she said calmly. "I'm in the correct seat, 1A. Her voice didn't need to rise. It didn't need to echo. It settled into the cabin like a quiet warning, measured, unbothered, and impossible to ignore. Across the aisle, Daniel Jennings lowered his tablet. He was a man used to recognizing patterns, reading data between the lines and understanding tension, especially the kind people pretend not to notice. Something about this felt off. Daniel had flown Sky Era dozens of times. He'd seen plenty of entitled passengers and difficult staff interactions. But this wasn't that. This wasn't a dispute over luggage space or missed champagne. This was something colder. He looked at Ava more closely. Her posture was impeccable. She wasn't arguing, wasn't provoking, wasn't doing anything but sitting quietly, firmly in a seat she had clearly paid for. And yet Brenda stood over her like a hall monitor clinging to some moral authority. Daniel's eyes flicked toward the flight manifest on Brenda's tablet. It was locked unopened, just like her willingness to see what was really going on. He could tell she hadn't checked it not once. A few passengers began to murmur. Megan Cross had stopped pretending to read her fashion magazine. She glanced toward Ava with that familiar look, half curiosity, half judgment. "Just move." "Seats," someone behind muttered. "Is it really worth the drama?" Ava heard them. She always did. But her gaze never left Brenda. It wasn't pride that kept her still. It wasn't stubbornness. It was clarity. She had learned over years of navigating rooms that weren't built for her, that the most dangerous thing to do wasn't to shout, but to stand still and let the world reveal itself. And right now, it was revealing Brenda's jaw clenched. She took one step closer, tapping her earpiece. "I'll be escalating this," she said, half to Ava and half to no one. "There are procedures, and you're violating them." "No," Ava said simply, her voice low. "You are." For the first time, Brenda blinked. Daniel watched the exchange carefully, his hands now resting on his seat tray, no longer interested in his flight plan or emails. Ava wasn't threatening. She wasn't smug. She was watching, recording, perhaps not with a phone, but with something more dangerous: memory. Patience, power. Brenda took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and turned sharply toward the galley. "Security will handle it," she snapped. But something in the cabin had already shifted. No one applauded her control. No one nodded in agreement. Even Megan looked vaguely uncomfortable now, shifting in her seat, unsure which way to lean. And Daniel? He leaned back slowly and whispered to himself, "She's not just another passenger, not even close." The captain's voice had just echoed through the intercom. Final preparations for takeoff, when Ava Hartley pressed the service button. She didn't do it quickly or with any sense of entitlement. Her finger moved with the same calm intention she had shown since the moment she boarded. The chime was soft, almost hesitant. All she wanted was a glass of water. Brenda Fields arrived a moment later, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak, just stood there, eyes fixed on Ava like a security camera searching for fault. "Could I have a glass of water, please?" Ava asked politely, looking up. Brenda's silence lingered longer than it needed to. Finally, she nodded once and turned toward the galley. She returned less than a minute later, a silver tray in her hand, 3 glasses of water balanced on it, condensation already dripping from the rims. But as Brenda approached, something shifted in her stride, barely noticeable but intentional. She turned just slightly at the last second, and the tray tilted, not violently, not enough to make it seem like an accident worth correcting, just enough to send a rush of cold water cascading into Ava's lap. The splash was sharp. The sound of ice clinking against the tray echoed like glass breaking in a silent room. Ava exhaled, not loudly, not dramatically, just one breath. She looked down at her soaked slacks. A line of cold water traced her thighs, soaking through to her skin. Then she looked back up at Brenda. "You did that on purpose," Ava said, her voice quiet but unmistakably clear. Brenda gasped, stepping back as if insulted by the accusation. "Excuse me," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "You extended your leg. That tray barely." "You did it on purpose," Ava repeated. That was it. No raised voice, no spectacle, but the cabin noticed. Megan Cross, seated 2 rows back, had watched the entire exchange. She hadn't said anything before. She had told herself it wasn't her business, that perhaps Brenda was just doing her job. But now she could feel the guilt sinking in. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't a misstep. It was a message. Ava didn't wipe the water away. She didn't flinch or demand towels. She sat still, her legs wet, her hands folded neatly on the tray in front of her. That quiet strength unnerved the entire cabin more than any outburst could have. Daniel Jennings reached slowly for his phone, resting it on the armrest. He didn't press record yet, but his thumb hovered over the button. He knew where this was heading. He just didn't know how far Brenda would go. In the row behind Ava, a younger couple exchanged wide-eyed glances. One of them whispered, "Did that just happen?" Brenda stood motionless, the tray still in her hands, her knuckles turning white. For a second, she looked like she might say something, an apology perhaps, but then her expression hardened. "If you'd like to file a complaint," she said stiffly, "I'm sure the cabin supervisor can assist you after takeoff." "No need," Ava replied, dabbing her napkin once on her soaked lap, then folding it calmly beside her glass. "I'm taking care of it myself." Brenda didn't know what that meant, but Daniel did. So did Megan. So did the couple behind her. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. And it wasn't just for Brenda. It was for everyone who thought Ava was just another woman in the wrong seat. They were about to find out she was in the right seat, just not for the reasons they assumed. The cabin was heavy with tension now, thick like coastal fog before a storm. Whispers swirled beneath the hum of the engines, and the once invisible boundaries between passenger and crew had turned sharp. Ava Hartley, still damp from the water Brenda had accidentally spilled on her, sat in seat 1A like a mountain unmoved. Her posture was flawless, her expression unreadable. She had neither raised her voice nor escalated the situation. She had simply stated the truth. "You did that on purpose." It echoed louder in the cabin than any shouted accusation. Brenda Fields hadn't spoken since. She'd returned to the galley tray, still damp eyes flickering with something no longer resembling control. Anger, perhaps, embarrassment, or worse, fear. Not of Ava, but of the unraveling narrative. The problem wasn't that Ava had broken the rules. The problem was that she hadn't. She belonged. And Brenda had been wrong publicly, visibly, undeniably. And now that quiet truth was spreading faster than she could contain it. Passengers were no longer pretending not to watch. A teenage boy in 3D had his phone angled upward, clearly recording Megan Cross' guilt settling deeper into her gut, sat rigid in her seat. Daniel Jennings tapped the record button on his phone and set it down subtly on his lap. Back in the front of the cabin, Grace Sky Era's youngest attendant stood silently against the bulkhead wall. Her clipboard trembled in her hands. She had seen everything. The water, the glares, the thinly veiled spite. And now the impossible question sat in her chest like a brick. What happens if Brenda keeps pushing? And then Brenda came back. This time no pretense, no tray, no performance. Just stiff movements, flushed cheeks and eyes like glass. She stepped up to Ava's seat again. One step, then another. The hush in the cabin was absolute. Even the hum of the jazz faded beneath the sound of blood rushing in every ear. Ava looked up, calm, patient, watching. "You think you're better than me?" Brenda hissed under her breath, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "You think you can just sit there soaked smug and smirking like this is your show?" Ava didn't answer. She didn't need to. And that silence again was too much. Brenda's hand came up fast. No hesitation, no second thoughts. Crack. The slap rang out like a thunderclap inside the confined space of first class. Passengers gasped. Someone dropped a drink. Megan Cross actually flinched in her seat. Grace dropped her clipboard. Ava didn't move. She didn't reach for her face. She didn't cry out. Her cheek flushed instantly, the red outline of Brenda's hand rising across her skin like a brand. But Ava's eyes never dropped. They stayed locked on Brenda's steady and devastatingly calm. And then Ava spoke. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Her voice was quiet, controlled, but it felt like a bell tolling in a courtroom. Everyone heard it. Everyone understood what it meant. Brenda froze, realizing too late what her hand had done. Grace, still standing in place, was pale. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Her eyes flicked to Ava's, then to Brenda, then to the passengers watching filming. Judging Daniel stood up slowly, his voice even. "Miss Fields, you just assaulted a passenger, in front of multiple witnesses, on camera." Brenda opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Ava didn't need to say another word. She simply straightened her blazer, adjusted her sleeve, and sat back, hands in her lap, cheek pink, with the truth that was now impossible to deny. The balance of power had shifted, and Brenda, who once ran this cabin like a queen, had just handed over the crown with a slap heard around the world. Ava Hartley sat still in seat 1A, her cheek faintly flushed where Brenda Fields had slapped her, but her expression remained undisturbed. The cabin was no longer just watching her. They were frozen by her. The atmosphere carried a fragile weight, as if any movement might shatter what little illusion remained of control. Grace stood near the galley door, pale and trembling, her fingers still wrapped tightly around the internal crew tablet. Moments after the slap, she had done what no one else had the courage to do. She opened the encrypted crew channel and quietly typed Emergency Protocol 9B Flight WS472 Assault on VIP passenger by lead attendant. Name Ava Hartley, CEO, tag verified. Awaiting executive acknowledgement. Her thumb hovered for just a second before she hit send. No one knew. Not even Brenda. Ava didn't yell. She didn't storm out. Instead, she reached into her slim carry-on, pulled out a sleek black phone, and opened a private, secure messaging app reserved for executive directives. She typed a single line, Emergency Protocol, WS472, engage immediate chain of command intervention, pressed send, then folded her hands again. 3 rows back, Daniel Jennings stood slowly, the way a man does when certainty finally confirms his instinct. "I knew it," he said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for Brenda and the rest of the cabin to hear. "I knew she wasn't just anyone." Megan Cross's face had turned pale. The smug expression that once curled around her lips had collapsed into something between shame and awe. Brenda, meanwhile, had taken 2 shaky steps back, but her voice failed to form even a single excuse. Then the cabin door clicked. The cockpit opened. Captain Mitchell Evans stepped into the aisle with a practiced calm, but his face was pale beneath his regulation cap. He didn't address the crew. He didn't speak to Brenda. He walked directly to seat 1A. "Ava," he said with formality, offering a small nod. "We received your message." The cabin leaned in, collectively, unsure if they were witnessing a rescue, an inspection, or something else entirely. Captain Evans turned to the cabin, his voice firm, trained and sharp enough to cut through the fog of confusion. "For those of you wondering what's happening, allow me to clarify. The woman seated in 1A is not only a confirmed first-class passenger, but she is also the chief executive officer of Sky Era Aviation and the majority stakeholder in this aircraft's parent company." A wave of audible gasps swept the cabin like a ripple. Ava didn't react. She simply nodded toward the captain. "I trust protocol will be followed," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, then turned his gaze to Brenda, who stood frozen, mouth slightly ajar. Brenda blinked, the reality slow to register. Her throat moved like she was trying to swallow something bitter. I didn't know," she said, almost a whisper. "That's the problem," Daniel Jennings said, stepping closer. "You didn't want to know." Behind him, passengers who had said nothing before now wore expressions of dawning guilt mixed with something else. "Respect." Grace moved slowly to Ava's side, her voice a trembling thread. "Miss Hartley, I filed an internal alert as soon as it happened." Ava turned to her and offered a small nod. "Thank you, Grace." Brenda took one faltering step forward, her voice pleading. "Now I thought—" "No," Ava said gently, standing at last, her figure poised, composed. "You assumed." And now the assumption had collapsed. The entire plane knew. And Brenda Fields, the woman who once believed she could decide who belonged, stood exposed in the cabin she used to command. From her face, Ava Hartley stood now, not with fury, not with fanfare, but with a calm that commanded the entire cabin. Her tailored navy suit, now marked with drying water, bore the faint outline of the slap across her cheek. But it was Ava's stillness, her poise, that held the power. She didn't have to raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Brenda Fields," Ava said clearly, "you are officially relieved of duty, effective immediately." The sentence landed like a verdict. Brenda's lips trembled. "Wait, Miss Hartley, I didn't know. I didn't know who you were." "Please," Ava blinked slowly. Her voice didn't rise. If anything, it grew quieter, but somehow heavier. "That's the problem," she said. Brenda took a stumbling step forward. "I was following policy. I thought you were just someone trying to sneak in. Someone." The word hung in the air like a confession. Ava tilted her head, meeting her eyes with measured precision. "You thought I didn't belong. Not because of my behavior. Not because of any violation. You looked at me and decided who I was." Brenda tried to respond, but her throat betrayed her. Her words caught, crumbled. And then came the final shift, the click of polished shoes on the cabin floor. 2 transportation security officers stepped through the cabin door, crisp in navy blue uniforms, escorted by Grace, whose hands still trembled but whose spine stood straight. Her voice was firm as she addressed them. "She's in violation of Section 240 onboard assault of a confirmed passenger." The lead officer nodded, removing a small notepad. "Miss Hartley," he said with professional clarity, "would you like to file an official complaint?" Ava glanced around the cabin. Dozens of eyes stared back, some filled with guilt, others with awe, some quietly recording the moment, but none with indifference. She drew a breath, then spoke slowly. "Yes, I am filing a formal complaint." Brenda flinched, visibly collapsing into herself. "But not because I'm the CEO of Sky Era," Ava continued. "Not because I own this plane. I'm filing this complaint because I'm a black single mother who was humiliated in front of strangers. I was slapped across the face while sitting in the seat I paid for by someone who assumed I didn't belong." No one said a word. The jazz had stopped long ago. Even the hum of the plane seemed quieter now. Brenda's eyes pooled with tears. Please, Miss Hartley, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Just give me a chance to explain." Ava didn't respond. She didn't have to. The officer approached Brenda with practiced solemnity. "Brenda Fields, you are under arrest for battery under federal aviation law. You have the right to remain silent." Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Handcuffs clicked into place with finality. As Brenda was escorted down the aisle, she passed every passenger she'd once commanded. Every row she had strutted past. Now those same faces looked back, not with sympathy, but with silence. She glanced back once at Ava, as if hoping for a lifeline. But Ava had already turned toward Grace. "You did the right thing," Ava said softly. Grace nodded, her voice shaky but proud. "You gave me the courage to—" And as Brenda disappeared through the cabin door, the plane felt lighter, like a weight had finally been lifted. A storm had passed, but the reckoning had just begun. The plane touched down at Newark Liberty International with a smooth thrum, but the cabin remained unusually still. Passengers weren't rushing to unbuckle their seatbelts or retrieve their bags. They were waiting for the woman in seat 1A to move first. Ava Hartley stood quietly adjusting the blazer that still bore a faint watermark on one sleeve. Her cheek, though no longer red, held the invisible weight of what had happened and what she had turned it into. The cabin door swung open. Outside the jet, bridge had been cleared for privacy. A sleek black SUV with government plates waited at the bottom of the stairs. Two Sky Era executives in matching Navy suits stood on either side of the door, eyes focused on the ground until she stepped forward. "Miss Hartley," one of them said, bowing his head slightly. "Welcome home." Ava didn't respond right away. She turned first to the passengers behind her. She didn't need to say anything, but a voice broke the silence before she could take her first step. "Miss Hartley," said a woman from row 4, rising carefully. Her voice was soft, trembling. I wanted to say thank you. You didn't have to speak up, but you did, and you spoke for all of us who've been told we don't belong." The entire cabin seemed to exhale. Applause began. Quiet at first, then stronger. It wasn't the kind of forced clapping people give at a landing or a farewell. This was deliberate, earned. Megan Cross, who had stayed silent through most of the flight, stood as well, eyes glassy. She didn't say anything, just clapped Daniel. Jennings offered a nod of deep respect as Ava passed one of the younger passengers, maybe 20, maybe a college student, raised his phone and whispered, "She's the real deal." Ava finally offered a small smile. Not proud, not victorious, just honest. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, the New York skyline in the distance, the cameras began to flash, not from passengers but from reporters who had caught wind of the unfolding story through leaked crew chatter. Microphones weren't shoved into her face. Instead, they hung cautiously near her path. Reverent. Her assistant Julia stepped beside her, holding a tablet open with headlines already forming. "CEO slapped in first class. Responds with grace, not fury, she owns the plane. Sky Era CEO's quiet show of power." Respect is not a reward, it's a right. Ava Hartley goes viral. That last quote had already started trending. It had been picked up by advocacy pages, leadership blogs, and even a public school teacher in Atlanta who shared it with the caption, "My students need to know what real leadership looks like." Ava stopped beside the SUV, took a final glance back toward the plane and nodded once. Not for the cameras, not for the crowd, but for the moment. Then she turned to Julia and said simply, "Tell legal to proceed. I want training reviews, accountability measures, and every single cabin crew member recertified. Respect won't just be a slogan. It will be our foundation." Julia tapped a note quickly into the tablet. "Already in motion, ma'am." Before stepping into the car, Ava looked down the terminal and locked eyes with one last passenger, Grace. Still in uniform, standing just beyond the press, Grace met her gaze and gave a single quiet nod. Ava returned it, then climbed into the car and shut the door. Justice had taken flight, but now it was about to land in every policy, every procedure, every seat. Wherever dignity had once been optional, it was now non-negotiable. In the weeks following the flight that changed everything, Ava Hartley didn't disappear into the headlines. She went to work. Not behind closed doors, not with vague PR statements or surface-level apologies, but with decisive structural reform. At Sky Era Aviation's Chicago headquarters, Ava walked into the boardroom not with a legal team or a fleet of PR advisors, but with a binder labeled in bold, "Operation Clear Skies, Restoring Trust Through Policy." She placed it on the table and looked around at her senior team, each one carefully avoiding eye contact, knowing they had failed to anticipate the cultural rot within their own cabins. "This isn't about protecting a brand," Ava said, voice firm. "It's about making sure what happened on WS 472 never happens again. Not on my watch, not in my sky." Inside the binder was a sweeping blueprint. First, an 8-week mandatory bias training course for every Skyera employee, from flight attendants to C-suite executives. No online quizzes, no check-the-box modules, real instructors, real discussion, real consequences. Then came the Dignity Line, a 24/7 anonymous hotline that allowed staff and passengers to report any act of discrimination, disrespect, or ethical breach. The line didn't filter through HR or middle management. It went directly to an independent review board reporting weekly to Ava herself. Next, she unveiled the Justice Dashboard, a live internal system tracking behavior patterns and complaint clusters across the airline. If 3 reports surfaced about a particular gate agent in a single week, alerts triggered immediate investigation, no more hiding behind paperwork. And finally, the most controversial clause, zero tolerance for discrimination. One verified incident, whether racial, gender-based, or rooted in unconscious bias, meant immediate termination. No severance, no reassignment. Some board members pushed back. "This is a legal minefield," one warned. "It's a moral imperative," Ava replied. "If we lose business over it, we deserve to." And then something unexpected happened. Other airlines followed. Delta Sphere. Aviation released a statement announcing its own internal review. SkyWest Horizons invited Ava to consult on cultural reform. Even international carriers like Aerolux and Nor-Atlantic reached out to request her insight. But Ava declined most of the speaking offers. She didn't want to become a brand ambassador or a diversity mascot. She wasn't interested in photo ops or polished panels. She accepted only a few engagements, and only when the topic was ethics and human dignity, not marketing. Until these values become core operations. She told one corporate summit, "I'm not here to help you look better. I'm here to help you be better." Meanwhile, back at Skyera, Grace Holloway's name had surfaced in every internal meeting. Her quiet bravery on that flight, her decision to speak up when her superior stayed silent, had struck a nerve. Ava called her in personally. "You didn't just follow policy," Ava said. "You honored principle. That's what this company will be built on." Grace was promoted to leadership training coordinator for Skyera's new ethics program. Her first assignment helped design the curriculum that would train every future flight attendant under a new vision, not just of service, but of justice. And slowly word began to spread. Passengers noticed the change. Crew members felt it in the air. It wasn't just about comfort or champagne anymore. It was about dignity. One cabin at a time, the industry was being restructured not by force, not by scandal, but by a woman who turned silent humiliation into global transformation. And the seat they once tried to take from her, it had become the foundation of a movement. The plane was boarding slowly. Skyera Flight 223 from Seattle to Atlanta. First class was almost full, yet calm. No frantic pacing, no condescending smiles, just professionalism, warmth, and something else in the air. A quiet reverence. Ava Hartley stepped on board, dressed in a charcoal gray pantsuit with her signature leather notebook tucked under her arm. She no longer needed introductions. Yet the respect she received now wasn't because people knew her name. It was because they remembered what she stood for. At the cabin door, a young black flight attendant with locks neatly tied back greeted her with a radiant smile. "Welcome aboard, Miss Hartley. It's an honor to serve you." "Thank you," Ava replied. Voice low, eyes kind. "It's an honor to fly with you." The woman stepped aside and motioned her toward seat 1A, hers again. Not because it was assigned, not because she demanded it, but because this time the crew knew what the seat meant. It was more than upholstery and champagne. It had become a symbol. As Ava settled in, a boy around 7 years old seated across the aisle with his mother peeked over his tablet. His wide eyes were curious and full of quiet wonder. His mother whispered, "That's the lady from the plane." The boy looked at Ava shyly and said, "Are you the captain of kindness?" Ava chuckled gently. "I don't fly the plane," she said, "but I do believe in helping it fly, right?" He grinned. "I think that's cooler." Moments later, as the crew prepared for takeoff, Ava pulled out her phone and sent a short message to her daughter, Olivia. "You don't have to shout to be heard. If someone doubts your worth, stand and the sky will listen." She stared at the words for a second, then pressed send. She'd said similar things before, but today, the meaning felt deeper. Real tucked into the flap of her notebook was a small envelope. Cream-colored, handwritten. It had arrived 2 days earlier. No return address, just a simple note. "You spoke for the invisible. You stood when others would have bowed. You reminded us that dignity doesn't need a title. It only needs courage." Thank you for seeing people like me before the world finally did. Ava folded the letter again and slipped it back into place. She didn't know who sent it. She didn't need to. Outside the window, the late morning sun painted gold streaks across the wing. The clouds beneath them rolled like a soft ocean stretching into forever. Ava leaned back, the hum of the engines washing over her, and closed her eyes for a moment. Not from exhaustion, but peace. She wasn't smiling for the cameras. There were no reporters, no boards to address, no policies to sign. Just a woman in a seat once denied to her, now freely offered. A seat she had reclaimed not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been quietly pushed aside, underestimated, or told they didn't belong. A seat no longer defined by who paid for it, but by the spirit of the one sitting in it. From behind her, she heard a flight attendant ask Miss Hartley, "May I bring you something to drink?" Ava turned with a soft smile. "Yes, just water, clean, cold, and freely given." The attendant nodded with genuine grace as the plane cruised forward, slicing through a sky that once held invisible ceilings. Ava looked out the window one more time. She wasn't chasing elevation. She was building something higher. And somewhere in another cabin, another person was finally sitting in their rightful place because she had refused to surrender hers. The seat was never about power. It was always about worth. And now the sky knew it too. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful true stories. This story shows that disrespect can cost everything, while grace under fire builds lasting change. It reminds us that injustice doesn't always wear a uniform, and that bias still boards flights, checks tickets, and pours water with prejudice. Such moments happen not just in the sky, but in workplaces, lobbies, classrooms, everyday spaces where silence becomes complicity.